Welcome back, everyone, to our little symposium in connection with the exhibition At Home, Panorama of Our Domestic Lives that we curated for the International Design Biennial in Saint-Etienne this year. I'm one of the co-curators. My name is Jana Scholze, and you see the other co-curators with me on the screen, which is Penny Sparke and Rossi. I would like to welcome everyone who joins us this afternoon, and it is my absolute pleasure that this early afternoon we'll see our second keynote by Dr. Anne-Marie Adams, who will join us from Montreal, and for Anne-Marie it's very early in the morning. I believe, I hope, I have to say that we just have a thunderstorm here in North London over us, probably in whole London. Penny is nodding. And I hope this doesn't bring us any disruption. I know that our designers are also here in North London, and we are very, very delighted that they will start our afternoon session. And I'm happy to welcome Scully and Brian Studak from the London-based cross-disciplinary studio Plate. We have an unexpected Canadian theme here, I noticed, because all our speakers, except for us moderators, are Canadian. However, Lauren and Brian have been in London for a long, long time. They founded their own studio in 2011. And had been before gaining experience in various fields from product, interior, and architectural design. They are, as they say of themselves, hands-on designers, and it was a pleasure for us to kind of learn, get to know what that means. It was not an easy project because most of us was, as we have said before, online, and it was more for us than for them, a surprise to see the exhibition in 3D. And it was Brian actually who said to me, I always forget that you actually don't see it as we see it because you had it in your head all along. And I would just like to say that Studio Plat are specializing in immersive brand, but for us mainly in museum and exhibition design and environments. They have worked with most important museums and cultural institutions here in London, such as Tate Modern, the Design Museum, the British Library, the Wellcome Collection, but also internationally, for instance, with the Bauhaus Foundation in Dessau. We are very excited that you are here with us and that you will briefly introduce the exhibition and the studio's work to us. I'm handing over to Lauren and Brian.
Great. Thank you. First off, thank you for inviting us to the symposium, and thank you for that introduction. You've gone over quite a few things, and we're going to be brief today, introducing the exhibition. We'll show you some of our early drawings and ideas, very briefly, a couple of drawings, and talk about some of the larger ideas around the exhibition design. Obviously, there's so much that goes into these projects, and we spend a lot of time making decisions and working with the curators and to get to the final project. So I do want to stress this is a brief overview, and we'll get through this and show you some of the ideas. Let's see if I can share a screen here. There we go. So Jana mentioned that we are based in London, and we've been operating now for almost 11 years, or 10 years actually. And most of our work is with museums. Sometimes we do get involved in commercial projects for corporations, and more consumer entities. We've just finished a project with IKEA actually and H&M, and we've worked with Laura Piana in the past, but most of our work is with museums. And our work really with museums is about engagement. It's about creating connections between visitors and the content that the curators bring forward. Is that, Jana, is that moving okay?
Yes, that's perfect.
Okay, great. Okay. So a few years back, we worked with Tate modern. I'm just going to show a couple of images from past projects to give you an idea, a quick overview of the way that we do the work that we do and making these engagements and connections. And this is a project that we did with Tate Modern a few years back, 2018, which was a retrospective of Annie Albers. And I always like to say for this project, and Lauren as well, that that Tate Modern is really good at putting really large Rothkos on the wall, but they realize, they stumble a bit when the scale of the work starts to get smaller, and that's when we were contacted for the Annie Albers exhibition. One aspect of the exhibition was that Annie's career was so varied. There was a lot of different pieces. It wasn't just wall-based artworks, but there was a lot of design in there. There was a lot of information about her teaching and about her studies throughout her career. And we helped to sort of take all that information and pull it together into a kind of cohesive experience. And one way that we did that was to sort of bridge between the existing architecture and the works on display by creating a new exhibition architecture that was both based on the scale and ideas of Annie's work, that being the loom-based works, which are all grid-based, and also working against the grid of the existing building at South Bank, the Tate Modern building by Herzog and Demeron, which is the fabulous galleries to work at, actually. And this is another view from that same project showing some of the showcase work that we did to create this feeling both of atelier, but also still feels like a white gallery, an open gallery space. But we also played with these translucent screens, which were all based on the square. So again, getting back to that cube and this idea of textiles and how they're produced. And we're using kind of very inexpensive materials to create these translucent screens that were used throughout that project. So it was really about allowing views through the exhibition, but still containing the pathway, which is something we again used in Saint-Etienne. This very quickly was a project that we developed as a design for the Design Museum in London, which was called California Designing Freedom. And it looked at Californian design culture and how that culture is really modeled after creating personal freedoms. So the idea for this exhibition was to say, okay, well, the visitor has complete freedom. We're not going to put any walls in there. We're going to offer up all of the content, and it can be sort of inhaled all in one view as you walk in, but to create different sections within the exhibition using color and these lightweight frameworks. This exhibition also traveled to other areas in Europe afterwards. So we were keen to use systems that they could manipulate and change to different locations. So now coming to the Saint-Etienne project at home, we were really excited about this project. We were at that point in time, we were renovating our own house. So that was something that we're having to deal with. But one thing that we felt was really going to be a strong player, as it quite often is in our projects, is the existing site. So this is a view of that gallery space, which is spectacular, and which is really interesting in how much natural light is allowed into the space, but also this idiosyncrasies of site that the floor itself is tilted as a large ramp in two different directions. So that was something that we had to deal with as well as a kind of construction concern. But I think forefront for us is that this image says, it really doesn't say domesticity. It doesn't say home. And so we realized right away that, okay, well, for this project, we need to start creating a context so that the objects on display can have a kind of meaning. So how do we bring the domestic into the space? So a couple of ways to do that, we realized was about three things: lighting, scale, and materiality and color. So those are the things that we started looking at and we started researching. And we came up with this concept of creating smaller volumes within the larger exhibition space. And so this is through some research that we did. This is on the top left there, that is the Moriyama house in Japan, where they've taken the house and kind of pulled it apart. So each of those little buildings was a room from the house. So we thought that that was a really interesting idea, but also this idea of the commodification of domestic design. We were doing our own renovations at the time, and we kept on getting these large boxes being delivered to the house. And then you take the items out and you start locating them within the house. But so this commodification became something that was really interesting for us. And so moving very quickly now into what is the design for the exhibition, is that we use these smaller volumes or boxes within the exhibition space to help to modulate the space, to help to create smaller spaces that the exhibition objects could be viewed in as domestic spaces and seen as domestic objects, if that was the necessity for each of these elements. Also to create specific environments for the different subsections within the exhibition. We also used, beyond the boxes, we used these small or low-level floor plinths to help to demarcate spaces for display, both to protect objects from visitor touch, but also, interestingly, to create what we call these pivot points, where an object could be located perhaps in not just one section of the exhibition, but in two sections of the exhibition. So for example, this area here, which is in between
well-being and connected.
Well-being and connected. And those items, some of which can be sort of seen in both of those sections. So that was another sort of approach that we had for the exhibition design as a kind of overall look. And also you see these yellow elements here. Those are what we like to say is kind of punctuation within the exhibition, which is those are section starts introducing each of the sections of the exhibition. And we kept the graphics to a very simple and kind of utilitarian palette. And Margot Lombard from Lombard Studio worked with us on this project. So we didn't do the graphics in-house. We often work with other designers to develop that. And that's a kind of overall view of our exhibition design. I'll show you some views within the exhibition space. So this is a view into the identity section. And you can see that we have a display within that volume, which is quite informal in its array, and allows viewers to view through these volumes, but also have views to many of the different scenes or sets within each of these volumes. So there's multiple windows in the volumes. We have each volume has its own lighting source. So you can have these kind of bright boxes within an overall space. And you can see here, we've got, talk about materiality a bit. These are graphics that are printed onto a sustainable cardboard substrate. And then we used cardboard as a way of connecting to sustainability for this exhibition. So we used a product out of Italy, which is a 50 mil thick honeycomb cardboard material to create these boxes. So that is something which is then recycled after the exhibition. And we were also keen to use, over on the right here, these terracotta tiles that were available on site, that were used in previous exhibitions, and will be used in future exhibitions, I'm sure, as a way, again, of introducing reuse into the project, which is, a great strategy for sustainability, something that we're really acutely aware of in our projects. So you can see here that lovely daylight coming into the space and creating something quite bright and welcoming towards the front of the exhibition zone. And then you can see here how the boxes and wall volumes and the low plinths start to create spaces for visitors, but also allow the exhibition itself to feel open and bright and welcoming. So I think that what we like to do is create designs that where the visitor can feel a bit of agency, that they can feel as though they can choose their route through and define their own experience. And that's, I think, what's great about having very open spaces. another view through the exhibition. You can see, so the graphics were located on these suspended banners, and wherever you can suspend things, that's a lot of material that you don't need to use in supporting it from the floor. So that's another way that we can reduce our footprint, developing the design of the exhibition. And you can see the interior of each of these boxes had its own color scheme that then bled out from the inside into the threshold of the window. And those colors help to create environments that were specific to the contents of each of those volumes. I think what's also interesting about having the exhibition open is that you can create these different layers of experience. You can see both elements of the exhibition that you're going to see in the future. You can see elements of the exhibition you've seen already. You can also see other visitors in their experiential path through the exhibition. And then the exhibition finishes in a display which describes these urban parklets, one of which is just down the road here, but Jana used to live quite close by, knows it very well. And so we designed a parklet for the exhibition display, which we're hoping will be reused in the future for something similar, whether it's seating or something outdoors, remains to be seen. And that was our input.
Thank you so much, Brian. That was, I hope this gave everyone also an introduction to the exhibition, but also more of an idea how important it was to kind of work together and create these narratives. Of course, what you didn't mention was how difficult the conditions changed all the time because of COVID, and that at the beginning we had to kind of work with these large distances between us and between visitors to allow for a safe kind of environment. This brings us hopefully neatly to now our second keynote speaker. And I would like to kind of just say to everyone that Lauren and Brian will stay with us for the discussion afterwards. But I will now introduce Anne-Marie Adams. I think, Anne-Marie, you are here. Oh, yes, there she is. Anne-Marie is an architect and an architectural historian trained at UC Berkeley, who has now, and that was really fascinating for us and our topic, is jointly appointed in McGill University's School of Architecture and the Department of Social Studies of Medicine. I believe that Anne-Marie's research topics have become extremely urgent during COVID and during the pandemic, and being far more kind of responded to by people outside probably of academia and taking notice of. Anne-Marie Adams is the author of Architecture in the Family Way, Doctors, Houses and Women, 1870 to 1900, published in 1996. Another book is Medicine by Design, The Architect and the Modern Hospital, 1893 to 1943, in 2008, and co-author of Designing Women, Gender and the Architectural Profession in 2000. Recent awards include the Faculty of Engineering Christoph Peer Award for Research Excellence in 2016, and the President's Award for Excellence in Media 2017 from the Royal Architectural Institute of Canada. Welcome very much, Anne-Marie. It would be brilliant to have you with us in real space, but we are very grateful that you can join us at this early hour here online.
Okay. Thank you, Jana. I hope you can hear me.
We can hear you well.
Okay, fantastic. And now the miracle of screen sharing. How is that? Okay?
Perfect, we see it.
Okay, great. Well, thank you for that nice introduction, and it's such a pleasure and privilege to follow Brian and Lauren speaking about this amazing exhibition. It's such a Canadian thing that Canadians meet each other in international events. So that seems just perfect. And hello, bonjour from Montreal. Let me say what a pleasure it is to participate in this event and to see the photos of the exhibit. Thank you so much to the organizers for inviting me, especially to Penny Sparke, whose work I have long admired. So my plan for today in the following 15 or 20 minutes and with 20 slides is to present 7 points about COVID and architecture. You see a list of those points on the screen now with some short notes. The points are, or the themes are interior, Victorian, sick, social media, refuge, threshold, and grid. And when I read some of the information about the exhibition, I was so pleased that these themes intersected with the themes of the exhibition just magically. So these themes come from some of my recent writings on and during COVID. And I thought what I would do today is to try and just blast you with them and to use 1 or 2 pieces of architectural or photographic evidence for each of these. I've tried to probe the impact of COVID on domestic architecture. I also work a lot, as Jana said, on hospital architecture. But today I thought I would focus on how COVID might impact home design going forward and how it's changed the way we think about our homes. I have 3 very important admissions to make right off the bat. And that is that these themes, these points are just based on my personal observation. They aren't based on any kind of scientific research. And also that I've simplified them a bit to make them more provocative for our discussion today. And also, of course, as COVID restrictions are relaxed, some of these things are just starting to feel like a different reality. So first and really my main point is about the rising importance of the interior. And by the way, many of the photos I will show today are from this spectacular collection called the New York Times 2020 in photos, which I think are, I'm a sucker for these kinds of collections. So interiors, this might be obvious to many of you, are now more important to us because we were all confined for a couple of years. And my point here is really that because our own worlds were suddenly so contained, we're now willing to invest more in them. And I don't mean just more money, but actually more time and more study, I think, will be devoted to interiors going forward. And so I note with great interest the founding of an affiliate group devoted to interiors at the Society of Architectural Historians, as the US-based SAH. And I wrote about the rising importance of the interior on this in one of my favorite online venues, Parlor, that's showing on the screen now, which is based in Australia. And my last slide is a list of all these links. It's very, very important to remember at the same time that it's only a certain class or position of people who've had the resources to devote attention to their interiors during COVID. For many, the confinement to the private interior has meant struggles to share space while children continue to learn at home, to set up functional workspaces in houses, and to spatially separate work and life. And I'm not the only architectural observer to note the amazingly creative solutions that families have adopted in order to carve out functional workspace at home. And these have mostly been to make open spaces into cubicles or rooms, or a balcony into a school, as this New York Times photo shows. Journalists were very quick to announce that COVID would be the end of the open plan for houses. And one of my observations about hospitals under COVID, because I've mostly been asked to speak about hospitals, and this got some traction in The Guardian, is that hospital walls no longer matter, that PPE, personal protective equipment, are the new walls in hospitals. So what I'm saying is that I think COVID showed us that walls don't work to ward off infection. So for very different reasons, homes and hospitals are moving in two different directions in this regard. Hospitals, I think, will move towards an open plan, almost towards a Nightingale style or pavilion plan hospital like 100 years ago. And homes, I think, are moving away from the open plan. So with regards to the actual use of the word interior, as you see on the screen now, that's the blue line that's interior mapped against the use of the word architecture since 1960. There really is no discernible change. The use of the word interior has not yet gone up dramatically. But at the same time, our houses have never been in better shape. Domestic improvement, cocooning and nesting, as we've come to call it, often occurs after trauma or war. And the post-war home, the post-World War II home is the best example. But this kind of cocooning and nesting was also expected and documented after 9/11 in the US. So in the piece on Parlor that I mentioned, I challenged readers to come up with new vocabulary around COVID and architecture, because so much of the vocabulary is already architectural. So I'm thinking of words like confinement and bubble and social distance. Also very obvious, I think, is that our houses have become our workplaces, our schools, and in the case of my own family, a dance studio. So during COVID, for many of us, and this is the sort of exaggeration, our homes were the only places in our lives. So in architecture, I think this is a huge change in cultural ideology, that places might actually matter less. And as is well known, many of us took advantage of being at home to add new dogs to our family, or cats, pets in general. So this is our home on the screen now. It turned into a dance studio for our daughter, who was in a professional dance program. It's very challenging to study dance on Zoom. And our new puppy Willow, who may interrupt this talk at any time. And that is, I think, one of the great pleasures of Zoom and architecture. So as Jana said, I study hospitals, but I mostly study hospitals now, but I actually got my start in my career as an architectural historian studying British houses. And so my point 2 on my list is Victorian, and Victorian houses, which I studied in my dissertation, turned out to be best suited for COVID isolation. I wrote my dissertation on sickness in the Victorian home. It became this book, Architecture in the Family Way, came out in 1995. And of course, it enjoyed a great resurgence in readers last year after being very kind of sleepy book for 20 years. The argument of the book, to save you from reading it, is that I argue for this, this triad of architectural knowledge that I think operated among doctors, women, and architecture. And a great disappointment of the book after all this time, still haunts me, is that it's only based on prescriptive sources, on how women and doctors were expected to act. So my new work addresses this, and I try to find real responses to prescriptive sources about health and architecture. So one of the consequences of COVID, and again, Jana mentioned this, is that there was this COVID awakening about architectural history, that my stuff was suddenly interesting to journalists. And so I received a deluge of messages from journalists who were suddenly interested in ventilation and disease. And, most of them just wanted a kind of capsule explanation of how ventilation worked. So just to refresh your memories about the Victorian house and why it is so closely connected to ideas of medicine and contagion. The Victorian house plan featured separate rooms, and at least in Britain, very discrete circulation systems. You could close yourself off in a say parlor or dining room, and this was very unlike the Parisian apartment, whose rooms, of course, were connected en filade. So Victorian houses and housing, as it turned out, worked really well for COVID isolation because of this potential for shutting oneself off. So a kind of Montreal anecdote is that because of our long and narrow lots, city lots, and the triplex plans, that's our ubiquitous house type, the triplex, most of our houses only have windows on the short ends, which you see in these plans. So a map of Montrealers working at home during COVID would show intense activity at the front and the back of the house in a kind of barbell formation. And I'm only guessing, but I suspect that the English terraced house would not illustrate this pattern since it's so vertical. So house typologies, such as the Montreal triplex here shown from the exterior on a typical Montreal street, with direct entries to the exterior for most units, even on the second floor, were also newly recognized during COVID as healthy. And here's a typical street in Montreal with its plethora of exterior stairs despite the heavy annual snowfall. So as real estate prices everywhere soared, I think somewhat forgotten house types were rediscovered, especially those like this that offered a degree of so-called separation. So my dissertation and the book showed material like this on the left. This is a house section by Dr. T. Pridgeon Teal, and Teal blamed houses and architects for diseases that continued to spread. Images like this showed the house not as a refuge, but as a fearful place, a place that made you sick. And of course, there's lots of work on how sicknesses like tuberculosis have shaped architecture through the construction of sleeping porches and special ventilation in multi-unit dwellings too. And I want to show this book cover on the right because there's a new book coming out with Bloomsbury later this year. Maybe you already know this, called Domesticity Under Siege, Threatened Spaces of the Modern Home, co-edited by Mark Taylor and two others. And I'm really, really heartened that architectural historians are paying attention to the histories of risk, disease, and insecurity at home. This is a sea change in architectural history that I think will be a major theme in the literature going forward from COVID. So tensions between doctors and architects, basically that's what I study. And since 2016, I've moved half my teaching position to the Faculty of Medicine. So I'm lucky enough to be in a medical faculty where I get to observe every day how medical people talk about place. And that, I think, may also be a future trend, that medical students will learn more about architecture in their education as contagious viruses shape cities. So point number 3 is about architecture designed for sickness. Until World War II, houses were designed for sickness. There were designated spaces in Victorian houses, usually called sick rooms. I have a chapter on sick rooms in Architecture in the Family Way. And we have tons of paintings of sick rooms. This one on the left here by Edvard Munch, is the Norwegian painter, is probably one of the most famous. And I juxtapose it with a photo of a sick room from COVID, again from the New York Times collection of 2020, just to show how similar they are. I think it's fascinating that so many COVID images echo themes in art from 100 years ago. There's always a bed, of course, there's always a sick person in the bed, a religious image, and a mix of medical, religious, and family figures, and this sort of atmosphere of gravity and worry. Point number 4 is the impact of social media. I hope you all know the Twitter account Room Raiders, which I'm absolutely addicted to, which rates Zoom interiors. It's a voyeurism to an extreme, but I'm very interested in how it has domesticated media personalities. Like here is a fresh example from yesterday, Dr. Sabrina Ramanoff. And I particularly like the ones where Room Raiders assesses the interior and then the person responds on Twitter, like Dr. Romanoff, who promises to reposition herself next time. And I think this is just a whole new take on design advice about the interior. The second part of social media influence, although this is happily fading very quickly, is the influence of Donald Trump and his experience with COVID. So point 5 is home as refuge. And I use the White House, the US White House, as an illustration. And this moment of the expulsion of Trump from the White House as soon as he got his positive diagnosis. The message, of course, was that home is not where you should be when you have COVID. You even need a helicopter to get to the hospital, was the part of imaging of this, that you must fly away quickly and get away from your home. That leads to point 6, which is also about walls. I think COVID and architecture is all about walls, and that is the newly important threshold, which marks the line between private and public, which under COVID became relatively decorated and celebrated. So these COVID rainbows, these charming hand-drawn rainbows, were always on the front walls of houses, on the facade or the so-called face, of course, of the house, which I would argue became the new great divide between safe and unsafe. So again, this is an image of my house, and many, perhaps even most houses in Montreal sported these images during 2020 and 2021. A quick example here again of how many of the COVID images echo earlier themes in art, like we saw in the sick room. On the left is Manet's famous painting, The Balcony of 1869, and an iconic image from Lockdown on the right. My final point is number 7, living in the grid. Experts claim that the rise of Zoom has had a democratizing effect on us. City grids, of course, have proven not to be democratizing. And there was a compelling quote from The Guardian some months ago in a piece about how COVID has rewired our brains, which I think is absolutely right. They said, in contrast, pandemic cues are not organic. They are a series of regularly spaced people being processed by a wayfinding system. And it hit me that that's our new spatial order. In addition to one-way traffic systems that we learned from grocery stores, at least here in Canada, we are now living in these gridded patterns. So my final proof, of course, is just to look at us today. This is a webinar, so it's not as obvious, but in a regular Zoom class or Zoom gathering, of course, our gridded composition is exactly that. We're like the windows in the apartment building, that this is the new architecture. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Anne-Marie. That was fascinating. And it kind of extended in a really beautiful way the discussion we had this morning, and also kind of moved our discussion slightly out into architecture, to kind of really look at architecture again. However, where it very much for me connected with the morning is the question of how much the architecture is not so necessarily just building these interiors, but also building, for instance, examples for other exteriors, or building examples for other spaces, as you have shown just now with the grid and in the public space. I would like to invite now everyone kind of on the panel again, and would like to invite Penny and Kat as well to join us. Anne-Marie, if you could, yeah, perfect. And Brian and Lauren, thank you so much for joining us. I would like to kind of encourage our participants to please put your questions in the chat, which we will come to as soon as we see them. I would like to kind of take the privilege of the chair and use it for a first question. And this is a question to both of you, to or all of you, Lauren and Brian, but also Anne-Marie. In kind of the question of care seems to play quite a big role in on the one side, the question of kind of addressing care and caring in exhibitions, that architecture becomes something that supports and supports a visitor experience. And of course, with Anne-Marie, the question of care in how much do these spaces allow us, and I think that was something that COVID really drew our attention to, probably for since a long time again, or for the first time for many, that how much the spaces we live in contribute to our well-being. Probably can I start with Lauren and Brian to kind of think around the question of care in for the exhibition design and for the designing of exhibitions.
That's a pretty open-ended question.
Definitely.
I mean, we were actually having a conversation earlier today about designing exhibitions and the human aspect of it, I suppose. You know, why would somebody go to a space to learn about a story or a subject matter or engage with content, I suppose, rather than, you know, reading a book or watching a documentary, or, you know, there's all of these ways now that we can access information at home. You know, why go to a specific space? And I think, you know, there's things that we do as exhibition designers which are not necessarily obvious, I suppose, but they are speaking to the body and how a body is choreographed in a space. You know, how we take a visitor from one place to another through a specific environment, and what they feel like, you know, what it might feel like for them. And there's ways that we do that, I suppose, but you know, we're not theater designers, you know, we're not necessarily going for drama and shock and awe, but we have to do things to make a visitor feel comfortable enough, I suppose, in order to really engage with the story. You want to interject at some point?
No, I think this is all good, actually. No, it's interesting because it was a discussion from earlier. Somebody came into our studio for an interview, and we were discussing this with them, and I think that there's so many. It is so open, this question. So,
I guess there's care on the one hand with the objects themselves, right? The museum cares for the objects, and there's that whole sort of you know, conservation aspect of things, but we don't necessarily get involved in that. I think as designers, we're more interested in the visitor and how to get them to care about the subject.
And comfort. I mean, just creating comfort for
Echo.
that's okay. You know,
I agree, because I mean, in many ways, of course, what we want visitors, and that is the whole question of care, to feel good enough that they engage with the narrative that we put in front of them. And I think one challenge that we definitely faced and felt during COVID was that there were all of a sudden so many new restrictions that seem to, on the one side, care about the visitor by providing, for instance, safety distance, however, worked really against the question of narrative and the question of how do you experience an exhibition. So that is a nice point. But I want to invite Anne-Marie into this discussion to expand from the exhibition to the kind of real experience of well-being in homes.
Okay, well, care is such a huge theme in architecture now. I feel like we're a little behind other fields, but it seems like every school of architecture has a lecture series with care as its theme, which makes sense during COVID. And I was thinking I would say something about houses and hospitals and their relationship, because they are, I think houses and hospitals are considered subconsciously the two most caring building types, the buildings that will take care of you and make you better. And they're always in dynamic interplay, that houses have gone from being refuges and places that will help, that will cure you, to places that will harm you and make you sick. As soon as people started getting COVID and family members were isolated with healthy members, that became really evident. And right now, at least here, hospitals are the last place you want to go to get better. They're just deadly sources of contagion. So it's very rare to study building types in concert like that. And I think COVID has invited us to do that. But I really want to say too how important exhibitions and the history of exhibitions have been in educating the public, and certainly middle-class women, about health and architecture. So the International Health Exhibition of 1884 was so important in London, and that's people like Teal were exhibiting their stuff there. But also the imagery within exhibitions has had this amazing power to educate people about the subject. And in Architecture in the Family Way, I wrote about the rise of the section, the cross section in women's magazines, where women could think about bodies and buildings in the same way. And it sort of overtook the perspective drawing, which was considered, the drawing for lay people, for people without special knowledge. So the kind of image that's in exhibitions today, and there's an exhibit at the Canadian Centre for Architecture called A Section of Now, which is resonates really nicely with the design of your exhibition. I think that sort of propels us into these images, and the open plan and the lighting makes us literally open to understanding what's going on. So it's the same sort of dynamic movement of knowledge. Thank you for your beautiful exhibition design.
I can only agree. Also, that helped our ideas that were at times very, very complex and very unmanageable, because there was so much to talk about this topic. I have a question from our participants, which I would like to draw attention to. It is a question for Lauren and Brian, which says, can you elaborate please on how you take into consideration the impact on emotion or mental health and psychology within your design choices? Which is a difficult question, I have to admit. You're muted, Brian.
Could we give women's rights as an example?
Yeah.
Could you talk about how we plan that out with the... we did an exhibition at British Library on women's rights. Some of which, the content of which was, what's the word for, some of it was challenging.
Sensitive.
It was sensitive. And so the idea was to create an environment where people could feel comfortable exploring those topics, and also feel comfortable having discussions around it. So, I mean, to communicate those kinds of things from an architectural stand, I always talk about architecture as being quite a blunt communication tool. But, you know, to provide space for people, sinuous space is what we did, very curvy and soft.
But also,
seating.
I think, you know, we also work in acoustic space as well. I mean, you're in an environment with lots of other people. British Library, if each institution has its own feel, right, within their gallery spaces. And at the British Library, it tends to feel quite quiet most of the time. And what we wanted to do was bring those noise levels up a bit. So we had a background sort of soundtrack, basically, which was sort of like sounds you would hear on a march, you know, but taken down, which provides a kind of level of ambient noise so that you feel comfortable talking to your buddy about something, you know, and people, somebody on the other side of the gallery isn't going to overhear you. So we had staged this. There was a lot of AV in the exhibition as well. So there was talking heads, there was soundtracks, there was sort of, you know, various levels to manage, I suppose, as you walked around the exhibition. And we also used a lot of carpet, which helped to absorb the sound.
Yeah, but also to give a kind of feeling of domesticity, isn't it?
Yeah, well. But we used it on the plinths, which is something we don't normally do. And we had a sort of area in the middle, which was their media space, which had a kind of, our inspiration for it was a kind of like 1970s conversation pit kind of area where people could feel quite comfortable sort of hanging out and lounging. And unfortunately, this exhibition opened like, it was almost due to open right when the first lockdown happened. So then the second time it opened, or the first time it opened, but it was several months later. You know, there was less of that environment where people felt comfortable sort of lounging around, unfortunately. But I think with, you know, we're always trying to provide an atmosphere that people feel comfortable in, but sometimes we have to make that more energetic. Sometimes we have to tone it down. Sometimes we have to, I don't know. Like, I think we are working with how does the space feel all the time, I suppose. So,
and how do we leverage that to make people feel a certain way, to be receptive or not receptive, or, you know,
I don't think we've ever set out to sort of, you know, really like irritate someone or like, you know, make something really uncomfortable. But, you know, sometimes
I'd like to try that.
Sometimes you do want to provoke a bit of emotion, I suppose.
If anybody's got a project that they want us to do that, I'd be really interested.
Most clients don't want that, strangely. They want people to hang out and
no risk taking in exhibition. I would like to invite thank you so much. I would like to invite, Penny has a question.
I do have a question because something jumped out at me because we discussed it this morning. So I thought it was very interesting to see these follow-throughs through the day. And that was the question of language. The point you made about the three words you've used as examples were confinement, bubble, and social time. Talking to Anne-Marie, obviously, bubble and social distance. I just wonder if you might say a little bit more about how you think, what happens with the emergence of obviously confinement is not a new word, but it's being used in a new way. How do you think this sort of language enters into our lives and alters us?
Well, that's a great question. And I was just thinking about that while Brian and Lauren were speaking about exhibitions under COVID. And I was wondering whether we are less likely to dwell somewhere. That do you think people will just always see exhibitions now while they're moving? I mean, I'm still quite nervous when I'm out in public. I still wear a mask and the numbers aren't great in Montreal. So I never stop. So will you design exhibitions in the future with that in mind? Will the exhibition space be more designed at a clip? And so to answer your question, Penny, I think it's so amazing that we learned how to move in grocery stores, at least here. I mean, that's where the circulation patterns were best defined, with arrows on the floor. And then that was transported into the metro system in Montreal and the university and other public spaces. And another thing that I think is quite shocking, I probably should have included as one of my points, is these images of public spaces that we're used to seeing full of crowds suddenly empty. And some journalists have been accused of overdoing those images, that, you know, just capturing the Louvre with nobody in it, when it never really was like that. But I think that's changed our perception too of the public.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you.
There is another question from Rian, one of our speakers this morning, Anne-Marie, to you. And Rian asks, do you think due to COVID, we will change our floor plan, build sick rooms, be more present in the home again? Don't go to the hospital. As you said, this is quite a dangerous place. And we want to look after our loved ones ourselves. Might this be a transition that we see in the near future?
Yes, I think for people who can afford to renovate their houses in really in major ways, we're seeing that. We're seeing double kitchens and, you know, dedicated workspaces and sections of the house dedicated to sickness again. It's really a return to the, you know, huge Victorian house plan. And the same thing is happening in hospitals where, well, the London example was even called the Nightingale Hospital, which is basically just a big warehouse of people in a pavilion. Really interesting that Victorian architecture became such a model. And we thought of modern architecture and modern house plans as so neutral, but in fact, what COVID exposed was that some parts of modernism were quite dangerous, very not neutral.
I would like to kind of ask whether Kat would like to ask the last question. Unfortunately, this hour is by.
Thank you, Jana. It's quite a small question, really, but it does link to Rianne's question, which was about an object that you mentioned, Anne-Marie, that we don't actually feature in the show, but which is the bed. And in your talking about the house and the hospital, and in the images that you showed, the kind of the changing status of the bed, and I wondered if you had any reflections on its changing identity, its changing place within the home, and even potentially its design.
Yeah, that's a great question. I haven't really thought much about it, but I come to you from my Montreal bedroom, which is a pretty amazing thing that we join the public from our private spaces, of course, blurred, so you can't see the mess. But again, that's part of the new use of the bedroom. In hospitals, we've seen, you know, the hospital bed has an elaborate history and is like the dentist chair is such a high technology now. I don't think we'll see those kinds of beds in houses. So I haven't seen that overlap, but I'll watch for it now that you've asked.
Thank you so much. I think that brings us to a close, and I would really, really like to thank first and foremost Anne-Marie for an early start to the day and immediately talking publicly from your bedroom. And I would also like to thank Lauren and Brian for joining us. Please stay with us if you can for the rest of the afternoon. We have one more session after a short tea break that will bring us now to 2:30 in London, 3:30 in Europe. And I'm not quite sure.
You're 20.
Anne-Marie.
Yeah, 20 past.
Oh, 20 past.
We
Okay.
come back at 20 past, yeah.
That's true. Thanks so much, Penny, for the correction. So in 20 minutes, we will all be back here for our last two conversations. That is, Kat will talk to Stephen Burks from New York, who joins us from New York. And I will talk with Liam Young, who talks to us from Los Angeles, which is even earlier than Montreal, I believe. And then we will have a final discussion in summing up. So thank you so much for this panel, and I see you all in 20 minutes.